Echoes in the Deep Brine, Chapter 7, The Stillness Express. The air in the makeshift observation post was colder than the bellows average and just as wet. Condensation beaded on the bank of monitors, tracing slow paths down the polymer screens like tears. Each drop that fell from the corroded ceiling conduit landed with a rhythmic percussive tock that set Jorin Vask's teeth on edge. The smell was a familiar Haven cocktail, ozone from stressed electronics, the metallic tang of recycled air, and beneath it all, the sweet, earthy rot of fungal spores fighting a losing battle against rusting steel. "Status on the external seals?" Jorin asked, his voice flat. He didn't look away from the wall of flickering displays. A young directorate technician, his uniform already limp with humidity, fidgeted with a data pad. "All green, Forensic Theologian. Pressure is stable. Nothing in, nothing out. They're contained." The boy, NC, couldn't have been more than 20. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the feeds with a morbid fascination. "Chaos is always contained, eventually," Jorin stated, a lecturer correcting a student. "It simply exhausts itself." He expected to see that exhaustion. He expected to see the aftermath of the chanting sickness, shouting, weeping, spasmodic violence, the classic symptoms of mass psychogenic illness under extreme environmental stress, a textbook case ripe for dissection. He saw none of it. The 12 monitors showed different angles of the refinery's main protein reclamation vat, a cavernous chamber of catwalks, pipes, and grinders, all slick with a film of nutrient residue and glowing algae. And among the machinery, the infected workers moved. There were 53 of them, Jorin had counted. 53 dampskins who should have been screaming or catatonic. Instead, they were silent. Not just silent, but serene. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly alien to the jerky, efficient motions of factory labor. Their bodies swayed in a gentle, synchronous rhythm, like kelp in a slow current. Some stood on the catwalks, heads tilted back, eyes closed. Others knelt by the massive grinders, their hands not clutching in panic, but tracing patterns on the cold, wet metal. "Sir," NC's voice was barely a whisper, "the official report mentioned violent hysteria. This isn't violent."
"Hysteria has phases, technician," Jorin replied, his own voice tighter than he wanted. He zoomed in on a cluster of 3 workers near a conduit junction, a woman and 2 men. Their hands moved in unison, fingers sliding over a patch of glowing green fungus, their movements mirroring each other perfectly. Not just similar, perfect, as if guided by a single mind. "This is likely a post-manic depressive state, catatonia with patterned motor tics." He was lying to the boy, and worse, he was lying to himself. This wasn't catatonia, this was choreography. And then the humming started. It wasn't a human sound, not really. It rose from the monitors not as individual voices, but as a single resonant tone, a low foundational frequency that vibrated through the cheap speakers and seemed to press in on the small room. It wasn't a chant of disparate voices. It was a perfect harmonic chord, clean, pure. Jorin felt the vibration in the floor plates, a bass note that resonated deep in his own chest cavity. He glanced at the audio spectrometer feed on his personal datapad. The sine wave was impossibly smooth, flawless. "Rust rot," NC breathed, taking a half-step back from the console. "How are they all making the exact same sound? It's not right." Jorin ignored him, his focus narrowing. He toggled the audio, isolating the feed from a single camera, then another. The same harmonic, from every corner of the room. It was physically impossible for 53 untrained, panicked individuals to spontaneously produce a unified E-flat with zero deviation. It required discipline, practice, or something else. His clinical detachment, the armor he had spent years forging, began to crack. This wasn't an illness. An illness is chaotic, a system breaking down. This was the opposite. This was the emergence of a new, unsettling system. The workers weren't breaking, they were harmonizing. He watched a man, gaunt and with the pallor of chronic malnutrition, trace a complex spiral pattern onto the viewport of the main reclamation vat. The pattern was intricate, like a fossilized ammonite or a slice of coral. A moment later, on a monitor showing a completely different section of the chamber, a young woman 20 meters away began to trace the exact same spiral onto a control panel. She couldn't see the man. There was no line of sight, yet their hands moved as one.
"It's not a toxin," Jorin said, the words falling from his lips before he could stop them. His own voice sounded distant. "Sir? The neurotoxin theory. It's incorrect." He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, a ghost of the same feeling he'd had in the ruins of the Ethelberg commune, right before he found what was left of his family. The chilling realization of being fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. A toxin degrades function. It creates noise in the system. This is a signal. This is order. The humming deepened, the single note gaining texture, woven with almost imperceptible overtones. It was no longer just a sound. It was an atmosphere. It filled the silence, pushed out the rhythmic dripping, masked the hum of the electronics. It was a presence. He felt a sudden primal urge to seal his ears, to shatter the monitors, to make it stop. The sound wasn't just entering his ears. It felt like it was trying to tune his bones to its frequency. He remembered the old bellows slang for auditory hallucinations, metal hum madness. But this was no random industrial noise. This was intentional. His gaze snapped to monitor 7. A close-up on a woman in her 40s. Her face, usually etched with the exhaustion of a damp skin on double shifts, was smooth, placid. Her eyes were open. They were staring directly into the camera lens. Jorin felt a jolt, as if she were looking right at him. There was no fear in her eyes, no madness, no plea for help. There was only a vast, empty calm, a serene, knowing intelligence. It was the look of someone watching a mildly interesting specimen through the glass of a terrarium. She knew he was there. He felt sweat trickle down his temple, his meticulously constructed diagnosis, mass hysteria, environmental factors, neurochemical imbalance, evaporated in an instant. Pathological specimens don't stare back with lucid purpose. Victims of a cognitive virus don't organize themselves into a silent, synchronized choir. This wasn't an outbreak of madness. It was a ritual of conversion. The woman on the screen smiled, a tiny, subtle upturn of her lips. It was not a human smile. It held no warmth, no emotion he could name. It was the mask of a mask.
Not from the speakers, not from the floor. It was inside his head. A faint, perfect E-flat, echoing in the architecture of his own skull. He had contained the infected, but he hadn't contained their song. "Technician," Jorin said, his voice a blade of ice. "Get me a direct link to the directorate, to Otho Valerius. Tell him the neurotoxin diagnosis is void. We are not dealing with a sickness. We are dealing with a religion. The mobile observation post was a sterile bubble of reason floating in an ocean of decay. Inside, the air was a sharp, metallic cocktail of recycled oxygen and ozone bleeding from the humming banks of diagnostic equipment. For Jorin Vask, it was the only air worth breathing. He sat before a curved wall of monitors, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of data. His fingers, long and pale, danced across the primary touchscreen, isolating audio waveforms, cross-referencing biometric outputs, collating symptom timelines. Every flicker of an eyelid, every spike in cortisol, every discordant note from the quarantined protein refinery was another nail in the coffin of the divine. Patient 4B, elevated heart rate correlates with proximity to patient 12A, he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. He tagged the event, filing it under social contagion vectors. Suggests a hierarchical structure based on proximity to the perceived index case, classic delusion transference. On the central monitor, the video feed from the refinery's main processing floor showed the results of this delusion. 24 workers, their faces slack, their eyes vacant, stood in a loose, swaying circle. Their mouths were open, and from them issued the chanting. It wasn't a song. It was a cacophony, a jumble of low guttural tones and high keening wails that overlapped into a constant, arrhythmic drone. It was the sound of broken minds, and Jorin was mapping its every pathetic contour. He sipped the lukewarm nutrient broth from a polymer bulb. It tasted of nothing, which is how he preferred it. Flavor was an unnecessary variable. The post was his shield against variables. The cloying humidity, the fungal spores that painted the bellows in shades of sickly green, the pervasive despair that was Haven's most abundant resource. Here, there was only logic.
That's when he felt it. Not a sound, at first, but a vibration. It started in the soles of his boots, a low-frequency thrum that worked its way up his spine. The surface of his broth shivered, forming a delicate web of concentric rings. The chassis of a data server rattled softly in its rack. Jorin didn't look up. Geothermal settling, he noted into his log recorder, his voice flat. Minor tremor, estimated 1.2 on the Richter equivalent. No structural threat. It was a common annoyance in the arcology, the groaning protest of a city built on unstable foundations, powered by a volatile geothermal heart. The price of survival. The deep-seated pylons groaned in sympathy, a sound so familiar it was just another layer of the silence. But this tremor didn't fade. It held. The low thrum settled into a steady, pervasive hum, a bass note that seemed to emanate from the very bones of Haven. It was a physical pressure, a weight in the air that made his eardrums ache. The dust motes dancing in the cold LED light of his console began to vibrate in unison. Annoyed, Jorin glanced at the main video feed, expecting the vibration to have startled his subjects, to have produced a spike in adrenaline, a break in their collective trance, a new data point. They hadn't moved. They continued their slow, hypnotic sway, oblivious. Yet something was wrong. The sound. The noise from the speakers had changed. The chaotic, multi-layered chanting was gone. In its place was a single, pure tone, a low, resonant hum so clean and precise it sounded synthesized. It was the exact pitch of the vibration he felt in his own chest. Jorin's hands froze over his console. A prickle of cold unease traced a line down his back. "Acoustic resonance," he whispered, the words a reflexive shield of rationality. "The chamber's geometry. It must be amplifying the tremor's specific frequency, filtering out the other noise." It was a plausible explanation, a good one, but it felt hollow even as he said it. His fingers flew across the screen, pulling up new windows. He activated the live feed from the structural sensors embedded in the refinery's plasteel walls. A clean sine wave appeared stark white against the black grid of the analyzer. The tremor's signature. Beside it, he displayed the audio waveform from the quarantine chamber. He dragged one graph over the other.
They didn't just align. They were identical. A perfect, one-to-one correlation. The peaks and troughs were synchronized with a precision that defied acoustics, that defied biology. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't a reaction. It was a unison. A harmony. His own heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, disorderly rhythm completely at odds with the placid data scrolling up his biometric screen. The vitals of the infected were unnervingly calm. Heart rates were low and steady. Respiration was deep and even. There was no physiological strain, no sign that their vocal cords were being forced into an unnatural act by a physical phenomenon. They hadn't been made to sing this note. They had chosen to. All of them. All at once. "No," he breathed, leaning closer to the monitor, his face inches from the glass. The cold light illuminated the sudden doubt in his eyes. He zoomed in on the timeline, to the exact microsecond the tremor had begun. The shift in the chant hadn't been gradual. It wasn't a slide into a new key. It was a vertical line. A digital switch. One moment, cacophony. The next, a pure, resonant tone. The human larynx, a complex bundle of muscle and cartilage, could not recalibrate with such instantaneous, unified perfection. It was impossible. This wasn't a symptom of mass hysteria. Hysteria was messy, chaotic, human. This was systemic, coordinated. The illness wasn't just a cognitive virus spreading from mind to mind. It was networked. It was listening to the groans of the city's foundations. The physical world was not a stage for the delusion. It was an instrument in its orchestra. Jorin felt a profound intellectual vertigo. His entire framework, the meticulous model of faith as a pathology that he had built to protect himself from the memory of his own past failure, was being shaken apart. A virus doesn't synchronize with geology. A delusion doesn't hold a conversation with a geothermal tremor. As suddenly as it began, the vibration ceased. The pressure in his ears vanished. The rattling in the server rack stopped. Silence flooded the observation post, broken only by the hum of the air purifier and the frantic, panicked thumping of his own heart. He stared unblinking at the audio feed. The instant the seismic line on the graph went flat, the chant on the speakers shattered. It splintered back into the meaningless, dissonant drone it had been moments before. The swaying circle of workers hadn't missed a beat. To them, it seemed nothing had happened. But it had. Jorin slowly leaned back. The squeak of his chair was a shriek in the quiet. His eyes were fixed on the screen where he had frozen the overlay. Two perfect waves, one born of geology, the other of human throats, locked in an impossible embrace. The evidence was irrefutable, and the conclusion it pointed to was a dark abyss. He was not studying a disease. He was observing a response. A crack had appeared, not in the walls of the arcology, but in the foundation of his own certainty, and a terrifying, alien logic was beginning to seep through. The air in the mobile observation post was a thin, sterile lie. Jorin Vask breathed it in, a sharp ozonic tang of hot electronics and recycled oxygen, but it did nothing to mask the truth that seeped through the hairlines of every seal. Haven's pervasive scent, wet rust, low-tide brine, the sweet rot of fungal blooms, was a ghost haunting the machine. He sat hunched before a curved bank of monitors, his face washed in the flickering white and amber of scrolling data. Outside, beyond the polymer glass viewport, slick with condensation, the bellows district groaned, a beast of stressed metal and dripping water. "Maintain baseline," Jorin murmured, his fingers dancing across a touchscreen. "Cross-reference cognitive dissonance patterns with biosignatures from Quarantine Zone Alpha." The central screen displayed a schematic of the protein refinery sub-level 7. A pulsating, coral-like growth, marked in angry red, had overrun the primary processing vat, the shrine, a monument to his failure. His instruments were his scalpels, and he was determined to dissect this tumor of faith from a safe distance. In the corner of the cramped post, Brecker Hune stood sentinel. He was a slab of augmented muscle and quiet menace, his hydrocorpus enforcer armor dull in the low light. He hadn't spoken in an hour. A statue whose only movement was the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. He was a tool of a different sort, a hammer. Jorin preferred his scalpel. Then came the first discordant note in his symphony of data, a high-pitched whine from the energy spectrometer. A jagged peak bloomed on a graph that should have been flat. "Signal bleed," Jorin sighed, not looking away from the screen. "The geothermal conduits must be resonating. Filter for standard EM interference, prioritize theta band frequencies." The system complied. The peak remained. Jorin frowned. He reran the diagnostic. The energy signature wasn't just noise, it was structured. It had a rhythmic, almost biological pulse, but its wavelength signature matched nothing in the Directorate's extensive database. Not geothermal, not fusion core leakage, not any known form of radiation. It was simply other. "Curious," he whispered. He toggled the audio feed from a micro-drone hovering in the contaminated chamber. The usual ambient noise filled the MOP, the sizzle of failing lights, the viscous slosh of contaminated nutrient paste. But beneath it, something else, a low, subharmonic hum. It tickled the edge of his hearing, a vibration he felt more in his bones than his ears. He isolated the frequency. The hum synced perfectly with the impossible energy spikes, a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to answer the perpetual metal hum of the arcology itself. It felt less like a sound and more like a presence. He felt a prickle of unease, the ghost of a memory, a different cult, a different room, a sound that promised salvation and delivered only silence. He pushed it down. This was data, nothing more. "Brecker," Jorin said, his voice tight. "Are you hearing that?" Brecker's head tilted slightly. "The city groaning, same as always." "No, deeper, A rhythm. Brecker was silent for a moment. My implants are filtering it as low-frequency mechanical noise, non-threatening. Of course they were. His implants were designed to enforce the directorate's reality. They would filter out God himself if he didn't have the right energy signature.
He switched to the material composition analysis. A remote laser was vaporizing microscopic samples from the surface of the biomechanical shrine. The data streamed in, a waterfall of elemental markers. Silicon, carbon, iron, polymer resins, hemoglobin. Wait. He leaned closer, the ozone smell suddenly sharp in his nostrils. The spectrometer was registering human blood components chemically bonded, not mixed, but bonded to the steel alloy of the vat. A covalent link between organic and inorganic at a molecular level. It was a violation of chemistry, a biological impossibility. Recalibrate, he commanded the system, his voice sharp with disbelief. Contamination in the laser lens. Run a self-diagnostic. Diagnostic complete. All systems nominal, the text flashed on screen. Reading confirmed. Jorin's breath hitched. His carefully constructed methodology was beginning to splinter. This wasn't a delusion he could map. This wasn't a mimetic virus he could trace. This was a physical reality that refused to obey the rules. Then the system screamed. Every monitor flashed red. Alarms blared, a cacophony of synthetic panic. A new reading from the mass spectrometer, the final arbiter of what was real, was the cause. Material composition. Unknown substance detected. Percentage of sample, 14.3%. Classification, null. Jorin stared, his mind refusing to process the word null. Not unclassified, not anomalous, null. It was a void in the database, a hole in reality. His most advanced instrument was pointing at a chunk of matter and declaring that, according to the sum of human knowledge, it simply should not exist. Simultaneously, the energy spectrometer went off the charts. The peak didn't just spike, it broke the graph, a vertical red line of impossible power. Warning, energy surge exceeds all known theoretical limits. Source, quarantine zone alpha. Profile match, catastrophic geothermal fracture event. The comparison was absurd. A geothermal fracture could crack the arcology in half. To have that much energy localized in a single room. Threat detected. Brecker's voice cut through the alarms, cold and absolute. He took a heavy step towards a locked weapons panel on the wall. A thick red lever was housed behind a clear case. Directorate Protocol 7 Gamma. In the event of an uncontained escalating biothreat, full thermal sterilization is authorized.
Flash incineration of sublevel 7, he stated, his hand resting on the case. It will neutralize the source. Jorin tore his eyes from the screen, a wildfire of panic finally consuming his clinical detachment. He saw it. Brecker's simple, brutal logic. The hammer seeing a nail. And he saw with horrifying clarity that it was the wrong tool. You can't burn a hole in physics. You can't shoot a mathematical impossibility. Stand down, Brecker. The command was raw, torn from his throat. It shocked even him. Brecker froze, his hand hovering over the lever, his helmeted head turning slowly to face Jorin. Sir, my orders are to contain. Your orders are irrelevant. Jorin scrambled to his feet, shoving a chair aside. He gestured wildly at the screaming monitors, at the cascading columns of error codes and null values. Look at it! Just look! What part of that do you think fire is going to fix? We can't measure it. We can't identify its composition. We can't even confirm it's entirely matter in the way we understand it. You pull that lever, and you might as well be throwing a rock at a hurricane. His voice cracked. The desperation, the raw urgency hung in the air between them, thick and choking. The alarms continued their shrill, mindless chorus. Jorin's gaze swept from Brecker's unreadable faceplate to the viewport, where the sickly bioluminescent glow from the refinery now seemed to be pulsing, in time with the alarms, in time with the hum, in time with his own frantic heartbeat. He sank back into his chair, the strength gone from his limbs. He ran a trembling hand over his face. The data was still pouring in, a torrent of beautiful, elegant, impossible gibberish. It was the language of a new reality, and he was illiterate. All his life he had believed faith was a bug in the human operating system, a flaw to be diagnosed, isolated, and patched. But this wasn't a bug. This was a new physics, a hostile upgrade to the universe itself. "It's not a malfunction," he whispered to the mocking, flickering screens. The alarms faded into a dull roar in his ears. The model is wrong."
The feed was a landscape of digital snow, a blizzard of corrupted pixels that swirled and coalesced into impossible shapes. Jorin Vask pressed his forehead against the cool, slick polymer glass of the observation port, his breath fogging a small circle that immediately beaded with condensation. The air in the antechamber tasted of ozone and wet metal, the constant hum of the recycler fans a monotonous counterpoint to the distant, rhythmic groan of Haven's pylons. Beyond the glass, the quarantined protein refinery was no longer just a space, it was a canvas. On the main monitor, a security feed showed what remained of the primary nutrient vat. It pulsed. A sickly cyan light throbbed from within the tangle of pipes and conduits, not the harsh, functional light of machinery, but the soft, organic glow of deep-sea life. The metal itself seemed fluid. Fleshy, coral-like structures had erupted from the steel plating, weaving through the catwalks and merging with the dormant reclamation arms. They formed a grotesque, biomechanical shrine. At its center, nestled amongst the pulsating growths, were the workers. They weren't moving, not in any way a person should. They were part of the structure now, their bodies seamlessly integrated into the fungal architecture, their heads tilted back in silent collective supplication. Jorin's mind, a finely tuned instrument for pathological deconstruction, was screaming. He ran the variables again, a frantic internal calculation. Mass hysteria? No, hysteria didn't rewrite physics. Industrial neurotoxin? A toxin didn't demonstrate intelligent patterned growth. Psychoacoustic resonance from the refinery's grinders? Possible, but the metal hum madness of the bellows caused auditory hallucinations, not biological transmutation. It was like trying to diagnose a fever by analyzing the patient's shadow. The data he was getting through the sealed observation post was filtered, second-hand, insufficient. It told him what was happening, but it was utterly silent on the how. And the how was everything. His failure with the cerulean dawn cult was a ghost that lived in these moments. He'd stayed detached then, too. He'd analyzed their scripture, cross-referenced their eschatology, and confidently labeled them a garden-variety apocalyptic sect with a charismatic leader. He'd filed his report from a sterile office, a dozen levels above them, certain in his rational assessment. And while he was drafting his final recommendations for psychological intervention, they'd opened the seacocks on their submersible habitat and embraced their luminous abyss. He hadn't seen the truth because he refused to get his hands wet. He'd lost his family to the political fallout, and his faith in his own methods to the crushing weight of their empty bunks. Never again. The figure of Brecker Hune stood by the airlock, impassive as the bulkhead itself. The corporate enforcer's augmented frame was a study in stillness, but Jorin could feel the man's attention,
a steady, patient weight in the humid air. Brecker was his bodyguard, his minder, a walking symbol of the Directorate's control, and Jorin was about to shatter that control. He pushed himself off the glass, the urgency inside him solidifying into a cold, hard point. The shift was palpable. The frantic analyst receded, replaced by something grim and pointed. He stalked across the grated floor, his boots clanging sharply in the quiet room. He threw open a reinforced supply locker, the door groaning on its hinges. The interior was neatly organized with sterile equipment. He bypassed the standard hazmat suits, grabbing only a compact rebreather mask and a pair of thick gauntlets. He slammed them onto the metal workbench next to the locker. His movements were jerky, efficient. Next, his hand went to a smaller, locked compartment. He keyed in his override code. The lock chirped its dissent, then clicked open. Inside, nestled in high-density foam, was a Hydrocorpus standard-issue sidearm, a compact kinetic pulse pistol. He checked the charge indicator, a solid green line, and slapped it against his hip, the magnetic lock engaging with a solid thump. Brecker finally moved, his head tilted, a micro-expression of inquiry on his otherwise placid face. "Dr. Vask, what are you doing?" His voice was a low baritone, calm and devoid of alarm. It was the voice of a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. Jorin didn't look at him. He was busy calibrating a multispectrum biosampler, his fingers flying across the flickering touchscreen. "I'm acquiring a new data set." He snapped the sampler shut and clipped it to his belt. He pulled the rebreather mask over his head, letting it hang around his neck for a moment. "We're going in." Brecker took a step forward, his sheer mass making it feel like the deck plates were shifting. "Sir, with respect, Quarantine Protocol 7 Gamma is explicit. Primary investigators do not breach the containment field until the contagion vector is confirmed and neutralized by a HazTac team." He recited the regulation as if reading it from a script embedded behind his eyes. "My directive is to ensure your safety. That means ensuring you remain on this side of the door." Jorin finally turned to face him, his eyes burning with a frustration so profound it was nearly incandescent. He stabbed a finger toward the monitor, where the silent, pulsing shrine continued its grotesque, hypnotic rhythm. "Protocol?" A bitter, humorless sound. "Protocol is for phenomena that obey the laws of this arcology, Brecker. It's for neurotoxins and viral agents and bacterial blooms. It's for things we can classify and contain with methods we understand." He took a step toward the enforcer, his voice dropping but gaining intensity. "You tell me, what protocol covers a belief system that learns to build its own altars out of steel and flesh? What diagnostic manual has a chapter on a mass delusion that can physically reshape a 500,000 kilo protein processor?" He jabbed a thumb at his own chest. "I have been sitting here, observing, deducing, theorizing from a safe distance, and I am failing. Again. All my models, all my logic, it's all just noise. Useless static against that." He looked from the screen back to Brecker, his expression broken, pleading, and dangerously determined all at once. "I can no longer be an observer. That is a luxury for a world that makes sense. I have to become a participant. I need a sample that hasn't been cooked by a remote drone's decontamination cycle. I need to feel the air. I need to smell it. I need data from the source." Brecker was silent. The hum of the recycler seemed to grow louder, filling the space between them. Jorin could see the conflict in the man's posture, the soldier obeying orders versus the man from the bellows who had probably heard tales of metal hum madness his whole life, who knew on a gut level that not everything in Haven fit into a directorate report. He saw Jorin not as a superior to be managed, but as a desperate man making a desperate but necessary gamble. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Brecker gave a single, curt nod. "The air inside may be compromised. Your rebreather is rated for 90 minutes. My suit's internal supply is triple that. I'll take point." He didn't wait for a reply. The enforcer turned and began his own ritual, a display of practiced lethal grace. He armed himself not with a sampler, but with a heavy-gauge pulse rifle from the same locker. He was no longer a bodyguard, he was an escort into hostile territory. Jorin pulled the rebreather mask over his face. The world muted, his own breathing suddenly loud in his ears, a rhythmic mechanical hiss. The scent of ozone was replaced by the clean, sterile taste of filtered air. He walked to the massive, circular airlock door, its surface cold and damp beneath his gloved palm. On the other side was a violation of reason, an infection of the soul made manifest, and he was about to step right into the heart of it. He slapped the activation panel. With a percussive hiss of depressurizing air, the locking bolts retracted. The great metal iris began to spin open, and the first true sense of the quarantine zone washed over him, cutting through even the rebreather's filters. The smell of a low-tide graveyard, of hot circuits, and something else, something sweet and fungal, like damp soil and bloomin' decay. It was the smell of a new and terrible gospel. The magnetic seal on the processing chamber door hissed, and then gave way with a percussive groan of tortured metal. Brecker put his augmented shoulder into it, shoving the heavy plate aside just enough for us to slip through. The air that washed over me was the first true shock. It wasn't the familiar recycled chill of the refinery, tangy with ozone and the metallic scent of nutrient paste. This was thick, heavy. It carried the low-tide smell of deep brine and something else, a cloying sweetness like fungal rot and blooming decay, all charged with a static hum that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. "Keep your footing," Brecker grunted, his voice a low rumble. "Floor's slick." He wasn't wrong. The grated catwalk beneath my boots was coated in a thin, opalescent film that shimmered with a faint internal light. It was like walking on oil-slicked mother-of-pearl. Every few feet, a new species of bioluminescent fungus clung to the railings, casting the narrow walkway in a ghostly palette of blues and greens. The usual drip, drip, drip of Haven's eternal condensation was still there, but it was now a counterpoint to a deeper sound, a low, resonant thrumming that wasn't just heard, but felt, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of my boots and settled deep in my bones. My primary function is analysis, deconstruction. I reduce gods to pathologies and rituals to behavioral loops. As I moved, my mind was already working, cataloging the data points. Unidentified extremophilic fungus, probable airborne spore transmission. The hum is likely a subharmonic resonance from compromised machinery interacting with the new biological mass. I was building a rational cage around the phenomenon before I had even laid eyes on it. "Jorin," Brecker said, his hand gesturing into the cavernous space ahead. "Directorate report said the main protein vat ruptured. They didn't mention this." We reached the end of the catwalk, which opened onto a wide observation gantry overlooking the main floor of the processing chamber. And there,
My rational cage shattered.
The main processing vat, a colossal cylinder of sterile steel that should have dominated the center of the chamber, was gone. In its place, something had grown. It was a structure, vast and intricate, that rose from the ferrocrete floor and stretched up into the shadowy heights, coiling around support pillars and absorbing conduits into its form. It was a fusion of biology and industry, a cathedral of flesh and rust. It pulsed. A slow, rhythmic tide of soft golden light emanated from its core, waxing and waning in time with the deep hum that filled the air. The light was not the harsh, sterile white of Haven's LEDs or the sickly green of fungal decay. It was warm, almost uterine. Great, sweeping buttresses of what looked like coral, bone-white and intricately webbed, supported a central mass of translucent, amber-colored tissue. Within this central mass, shadows moved, the vague outlines of human forms suspended and still, like insects in ancient resin. The missing workers. Not dead. Assimilated. They were part of the architecture now. Fused into the glowing pulp, their bodies had become conduits, their limbs branching and merging with pipes and wires that snaked through the growth. One figure was clearly visible near the base, its torso seamlessly integrated into a thick, pulsing artery of biological matter, its head tilted back in a posture of silent ecstasy, face turned toward the glowing heart of the structure. They weren't victims of a machine. They were components of a new one. A living one. "Rust rot," Bricker whispered beside me, the curse devoid of its usual anger, replaced by a hollow shock. "It's like a nest." "No," I heard myself say, my voice thin, clinical, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. "It's a fruiting body, a colonial organism, like a slime mold, but on an impossible scale." But my own words felt like a lie. This wasn't a random bloom. It had symmetry. It had purpose. The central mass, where the vat once stood, was clearly the focal point, an altar. The coiling growths that wrapped around the chamber's pillars formed a kind of nave. The entire space, once a monument to industrial efficiency, had been transformed into a temple. The air wasn't just thick with ozone and spores, it was thick with a sense of reverence that was fundamentally, horrifyingly wrong.
The hum grew louder, resolving itself. It wasn't just a vibration anymore. It was a chorus, a low, polyphonic chant that seemed to emanate not from any single point, but from the very substance of the shrine itself. It was the chanting sickness made manifest, the sound of belief given a horrifying, physical voice. I raised my data slate, my hands trembling slightly. I needed readings. I needed data points to anchor me back to reality. The screen flickered, struggling to process the environment. Biosignatures were off the scale. Energy readings were a chaotic mess of electrical and organic output, peaking in unison with the golden pulse of light. The atmospheric reading simply flashed, unknown biological contaminant, classification NA. The device was useless. It was like trying to measure an ocean with a teaspoon. It could tell me the water was wet, but it couldn't tell me about the Leviathan sleeping in the depths. "We're not supposed to be here," Brecker said, taking a half-step back. His tactical instincts were screaming at him, and for once I felt my own logic aligning with his gut. This place felt consecrated, taboo. Trespassing felt like a physical violation, a sacrilege my atheist soul couldn't comprehend, but my body understood perfectly. But my mission, my entire purpose, was to dismantle things like this, to tear down the altars and prove the gods were nothing but faulty wiring in the human brain. My last failure,
the one that cost me everything, began in a place that felt like this, a place of absolute certainty, of shared irrational belief. I had failed to understand it then, and the price was paid in blood. This time, I had to understand. I took a step forward, toward the railing of the gantry. The golden light washed over my face, warm and strangely comforting. The chorus hummed in my teeth, a lullaby of annihilation. Down below, the figures in the amber resin seemed to stir, their faceless shapes turning slowly in the fluid medium, as if acknowledging my presence. They had been singing, and this was their choir. "Jorin, what are you doing?" Brecker's voice was sharp, pulling me back from the edge. I looked down at my hands. They were steady now. The awe was receding, replaced by a cold, sharpened resolve. This was not a god. It was a specimen. The grandest, most terrifying specimen I had ever encountered, but a specimen nonetheless. "I need a sample," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the tremor I felt in my core. I pointed toward a tendril of the growth that had snaked up near our gantry, a cable of pulsing tissue and woven steel. "From there. We need to know what it's made of." Brecker stared from me to the monstrous living cathedral and back again. He saw the cold fire in my eyes, the obsessive gleam of the analyst who has just found the ultimate puzzle. "You're not just gonna poke it, are you?" "No," I replied, my gaze locked on the pulsating heart of the shrine. The light seemed to beckon me, the chorus calling my name. "I'm going to dissect it." The air on the catwalk was thick enough to taste. Ozone, hot metal, and the sweet fungal rot of the coral bloom. Below, the protein refinery's main processing chamber had become a cathedral to a new and terrible god. Machinery and flesh had fused into a single, pulsating architecture of ruin. Veins of sickly green bioluminescence throbbed in rhythm with the sound, a low, gut-deep chant that vibrated through the grated metal floor and up into Jorin's bones. It was a single, unified, inhuman note, sung by the dozens of workers fused into the biomechanical shrine. And at its center, on a small, clear patch of floor, stood one man. He was unremarkable in build, dressed in the same salt-stained gray fatigues as the rest of Haven's dampskins. But his hands moved through the air like a conductor, shaping the psychic symphony around him. Every rise and fall of his arms seemed to deepen the resonance, to focus the energy of the collective. Kalis Rendor, Patient Zero. Jorin's focus narrowed, filtering out everything but the target. His heart hammered a fast, clean rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of clinical purpose. This was the moment, the culmination of the hunt, the source of the mimetic virus isolated and exposed. Beside him, Gisla hugged herself, her knuckles white. She was a creature of data and shadow, and this overt, visceral display of the plague's power had her on edge. On his other side, Brecker was perfectly still, a block of coiled potential. His augmented eyes, flat and black, were already tracing vectors, calculating angles of attack.
"Two primary egress points," Jorin murmured, his voice barely audible over the drone. "The main archway behind him and the maintenance shaft to his left. The others, they're passive, catatonic. But we can't know if that will change once we engage him." "They'll change." Brecker's voice was a low rumble. "He's the signal. Disrupt the signal, you get noise." "Then we have to be faster than the noise." Jorin's mind raced, assembling a tactical schematic. This wasn't a theological debate, it was a pathogen extraction. Kalis was a tumor to be excised with swift, overwhelming force before it could metastasize further. "I'll go left," Brecker stated, not a question. Draws him away from the shaft. You and the girl have a clear path to the main arch if it goes sideways. Jorin nodded, the logic sound. But his objective wasn't escape, it was capture. "No lethal, Brecker. I need him functional. I need to dissect his pathology." Brecker's lips tightened into a bloodless line. Functional isn't always an option. He flexed his metal-laced fingers. "But I'll try." Jorin took a breath, the recycled air scraping his throat. He leaned closer to the enforcer, the command a sharp exhalation. "Now. Go." Brecker didn't climb down. He dropped. He swung himself over the railing and caught a thick, weeping pipe, sliding down the 10 meters to the floor below with the silent, fluid grace of a predator. He landed in a crouch, his heavy boots making barely a splash on the slick floor, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He began to move, a wide, flanking maneuver, using the grotesque pillars of fused metal and flesh as cover. Jorin watched, his pulse quickening with a cold, predatory thrill. This was control. This was order being imposed upon chaos, reason cutting through the fevered dream of faith. He anticipated the moment of impact. Kalis would hear Brecker's final approach. He would turn, his face contorted in fanatic rage. He would scream or chant louder, or perhaps the fused acolytes would stir, their limbs twitching, their voices rising in a shriek. There would be a brief, brutal explosion of violence. Brecker would absorb it, neutralize it, and the architect of this madness would be in their hands. But that is not what happened. Just as Brecker cleared the final piece of cover, preparing for the final explosive rush, Kalis stopped. His hands, which had been weaving intricate patterns in the air, fell slowly to his sides. The effect was immediate and profound. The singular, resonant chant that filled the chamber fractured. It stuttered, losing its rhythm, becoming a discordant collection of individual, confused hums. The pulsing green light of the shrine flickered, the network of veins dimming like a failing circuit. Kalis didn't turn to flee. He didn't scream. He simply turned, slowly, to face the approaching enforcer. He looked at Brecker, his expression unreadable. Then he raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture not of combat, but of complete and total surrender. Brecker froze. For a single critical second, the massive enforcer was utterly still, his body caught between the order to attack and the sight of a man offering no resistance. The kinetic energy of the moment evaporated, replaced by a thick, confounding stillness. Rust-rot, Jorin thought, his mind scrambling for an explanation. A trick, it had to be a trick. A psychic assault, a hidden weapon? But Kalis just stood there, waiting, a statue of placid acceptance. With a visible effort, Brecker's training reasserted itself. He closed the final few meters, his movements now lacking their earlier predatory grace. They were mechanical, hesitant. He grabbed Kalis's arms, shoving them behind his back. Kalis offered no opposition, his body loose, compliant. Brecker pulled a set of magnetic cuffs from his belt. The sharp, metallic click-clack of the cuffs locking into place echoed in the vast, unnervingly quiet chamber. It was over. It felt wrong. Jorin motioned to Gisela, and they began their descent down a nearby service ladder. His boots clanged against the rungs, the sound an intrusion on the new, broken quiet. The air was colder on the floor, the smell of brine and decay stronger. As they approached, the fused workers in the shrine remained motionless, their heads bowed, their discordant humming a low, mournful drone.
They were a flock without its shepherd.
Jorin came to a stop a few feet from Celius. Brecker stood behind the captive, a mountain of chrome and muscle, his hand resting on Celius's shoulder. This was it, the face of the plague. Jorin felt a surge of adrenaline, the familiar intellectual superiority he felt when confronting the purveyors of what he called spiritual disease. He was ready to begin the deconstruction, to peel back the layers of delusion and expose the pathetic, rational kernel of fear and megalomania at its core. He opened his mouth, the first clinical, cutting question already formed on his tongue. But Celius looked up first. His eyes, clear and startlingly sane, met Jorin's, and in them, Jorin saw none of the things he expected. Not the wildfire of a zealot, not the terrified desperation of the cornered, not the vacant stare of the insane. He saw a deep, bottomless, and profound disappointment. It was not the look of a madman at his captor. It was the look of a teacher at a child who had just broken something ancient and irreplaceable out of simple, brutal ignorance. The look didn't scream hatred, it whispered a terrible accusation. You don't understand. You don't understand what you have just done. Jorin's words evaporated. The triumph drained out of him, replaced by a sudden glacial cold that had nothing to do with the damp air of the stillness. The clean, simple lines of his diagnosis, of his entire worldview, suddenly felt blurry, inadequate. He had won. He had captured the enemy. So why did he feel in that moment like he had just made the single greatest mistake of his life? The air in the upper gantry of the protein refinery was a physical weight. It smelled of ozone, scorched algae, and the sweet cloying decay of fungal blooms, all layered over the arcology's foundational perfume of wet rust and brine. From their vantage point, crouched behind a corroded ventilation unit, Jorin Vask looked down into the heart of the plague. He had seen the picked feeds, read the preliminary reports from the first response teams, reports that spoke of mass hysteria and hallucinogenic spores. The words were sterile, clinical. They did not, could not capture the reality below. The processing chamber was no longer a place of industry. It was a cathedral of flesh and metal. The central reclamation vat, a colossal cylinder of steel that once rendered kelp into nutrient paste, was now a living, breathing shrine. It pulsed with a soft, sickly turquoise light, the glow emanating from the very metal itself, which had been warped and twisted into coral-like fractal patterns. Wires and pipes, once inert conduits, had become veins and arteries, slick with a viscous bioluminescent fluid. And the workers were the offerings. At least 24 of them were fused directly into the shrine's base, not simply stuck to it, but part of it. Flesh had flowed into steel, arms and legs branching into shimmering fungal lattices. Their faces were tilted upwards, slack-jawed and eyeless, yet from their throats came the sound, the chant. It was a low, resonant hum that was more vibration than noise, a single, unwavering chord that resonated in Jorin's teeth. It was the sound of a hive, a single mind in many bodies, and it filled the vast chamber, echoing off the weeping walls. The other workers, those not yet fully integrated, moved in slow, synchronized patterns around the shrine, their heads bowed, their hands tracing invisible patterns in the humid air. Their own voices joined the chorus, creating a drone that seemed to bend the very air around it. Beside him, Brecker Hune made a low, guttural sound. The corporate enforcer, a man built of salvaged iron and hard-won muscle,
was pale beneath the flickering emergency LEDs.
Rust rot. Jorin, what is this?
Jorin didn't answer immediately. His own mind was a tempest. This was pathology made manifest, the cognitive virus he'd theorized about for years, here in its most virulent and terrifying form. It was a mass delusion so powerful it was physically rewriting its environment. The reports had called it a sickness. He saw now that was too small a word. This was a new form of life, parasitic and absolute. He felt a surge of cold academic horror, a thrill of revulsion that was almost exhilarating. This was the enemy he was born to fight, an idea, a belief. "It's a mimetic apotheosis," Jorin whispered back, his voice tight. "They're not just hallucinating. Their collective belief is terraforming the room. They believe the machine is a god, so their biology is making it one."
Brecker just stared, his hand resting on the grip of the kinetic carbine slung over his shoulder. "Can you cure it?" "You don't cure a religion, Brecker. You dismantle it. You find the source, the first believer, the one who wrote the scripture." Jorin's gaze swept across the hypnotized flock below, his forensic mind searching for the outlier, the variable that didn't fit the equation. They were all lost, all absorbed into the choral mind, 100% infection rate, a perfect, closed system. But no system was perfect. There was always a patient zero. And then he saw him. Across the chamber, standing near the main power conduit that fed the shrine, was a man. He was separate. While the others swayed in their trance or were physically bound to the pulsing metal, this man stood still. He was thin, gaunt, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by sweat and the perpetual damp. He wore the same damp-skin coveralls as the others, but his were not yet stained with the phosphorescent growths that crept up their limbs. He was not chanting. He was conducting. His hands moved through the air, not in the random, worshipful arcs of the infected, but with sharp, precise gestures. A finger would rise, and the pitch of the chant would modulate by a half-tone. A slow downward sweep of his palm, and the rhythmic pulsing of the shrine's light would slow, the waves of turquoise luminescence lapping more gently against the walls. He was directing the flow, managing the output. His face was a mask of extreme, pained concentration. His eyes were not vacant. They were fiercely, desperately focused on the biomechanical heart of the shrine. Beads of sweat traced paths down his temples, and a muscle in his jaw jumped, a frantic staccato against the droning legato of the choir. Brecker saw him too. "Look, that one. He's not like the others. Maybe he's trying to stop it." Jorin felt a switch flip in his brain. The chaotic existential horror of the scene collapsed, condensing into a single sharp point of focus. All the dread, all the revulsion, all the sickening awe, it all found a target, that man. The pain on his face? Not the struggle of a shepherd trying to calm a panicked flock. It was the strain of a puppeteer manipulating 100 marionettes at once. The concentration, the focus of an artist obsessed with perfecting his terrible masterpiece. The gestures? They weren't wards, they were commands. He wasn't containing the madness, he was tuning it, refining it. This was not a shepherd, this was the composer. Jorin felt the ghost of his past failure rise up in him, the memory of another cult, another leader he underestimated, another pyre of bodies he was too late to prevent.
The guilt was a cold knot in his stomach, but it was fuel. This time would be different. This time he saw the source. He saw the pathogen in its human form. "No," Jorin said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling monotone. "He's not stopping it. He's conducting it." He raised his data slate, the device's autofocus struggling against the shifting alien light. He centered the reticle on the man's face, zooming in until the image resolved, grainy and haloed in blue. The slate's facial recognition software cross-referenced Directorate employment records. A name flashed on the screen, stark white against the dark background. Kalis Rendor, Maintenance Technician, Level 3. Kalis Rendor, Jorin breathed, the name tasting like an answer. The horror of the collective receded, replaced by the cold, clean fire of purpose. The problem was no longer an incomprehensible, reality-bending phenomenon. It had a name. It had a face. "He's the one," Jorin stated, his eyes fixed on the screen, then back on the man below. "He's the vector. Patient Zero." He lowered the slate, his knuckles white. The choir of the damned could drone on. The flesh shrine could pulse and weep. It was all just noise now, just symptoms of the disease. He had found the cure. He had to get to him, isolate him, break him down into his component delusions, and in so doing, prove to himself once and for all that this was all it ever was, a sickness of the mind and nothing more. The door hissed shut, sealing the world away. It cut off the perpetual drip of condensation, the metallic groans of Haven's tormented skeleton, the very smell of brine and rot. Inside was silence. A clean, manufactured silence that smelled of ozone and recycled sterile air. This was Jorin's element, a laboratory, a slide under a microscope. Triumph was a cold, clean feeling, sharp as a new scalpel. It settled in his chest as he surveyed the room. White polymer walls, seamless and severe. A single white LED panel in the ceiling cast a flat, shadowless glare. In the center of the room, bolted to the floor, was a single chair, and in the chair sat Kalis Rendor. His hands were bound to the armrests by magnetic cuffs, the indicator lights glowing a placid green. He wore the simple, salt-stiffened tunic of an ungrounded, his bare feet grimy on the polished floor. He was older than Jorin had expected, his face a roadmap of hard-won lines, his hair a tangle of gray and black. He did not look like a messiah. He looked like a fisherman who had lost the sea. But his stillness, that was something else. It was absolute. He wasn't straining against his bonds. His posture wasn't defiant, nor was it defeated. He simply sat, his gaze fixed on the blank white wall opposite him as if it were a sky dome projecting a forgotten world. He was the patient, Zero. Jorin circled the chair slowly, his own footsteps the only intrusion on the perfect quiet. He felt the familiar intellectual thrill, the click of a hypothesis locking into place. This wasn't an interrogation. Interrogations were for criminals, for spies. They were messy, reliant on the faulty mechanics of human fear and deception. This was a diagnosis, a dissection of a living idea. He stopped behind Kalis, just out of his peripheral vision. "I'm not going to ask you any questions," Jorin began, his voice calm, clinical. The room's acoustics were perfect. carrying his words without echo. Questions are imprecise. They invite narrative, and your narrative is the disease I'm here to eradicate.
I've studied your work, Jorin continued, beginning his slow orbit again. Or rather, the symptoms your work has produced. It's elegant, I'll grant you that. Truly. Most mimetic architects are clumsy. They build their systems on obvious foundations, promises of an afterlife, threats of damnation, the tired dualism of good and evil, crude tools for a crude species. He watched the back of Kalis's head. The man's stillness was a form of gravity, pulling all the energy in the room into itself. Jorin pushed against it with his words. But you were more refined. You found a pre-existing condition, a vulnerability in the arcology's own compromised biology. Metal hum madness, the dampskins call it. Auditory hallucinations caused by specific resonant frequencies from the city's machinery. A neurological flaw in the hardware of our society. Jorin clasped his hands behind his back. He felt like a lecturer in a silent amphitheater. The image of the refinery workers, their faces slack and their voices woven into a single horrifying drone, flashed in his mind. The image of his wife, Lena, her face in the flickering holovid. He pushed it down. That was then. That was a failure of methodology. This was a correction. You didn't invent a new god. You simply gave a name to a phantom limb. You took a meaningless neurological glitch and dressed it up in scripture. The chorus of the Brine, the drowned god, a song that connects you all. It's a beautifully constructed cognitive virus, Kalis. It provides a framework for the auditory phenomenon, giving it purpose, transforming random noise into a divine whisper. You gave their madness a shape, and in doing so, you gave them meaning, a powerful opiate in a world like Haven. Still nothing. The silence was beginning to feel less like a void and more like a substance, a thick, viscous fluid pressing in on him. Jorin's triumphant certainty remained, but it now had to contend with a growing irritation. A specimen is supposed to react, to squirm under the lens. He moved to stand directly in front of Kalis, forcing himself into the man's line of sight. Kalis's eyes were the color of the deep sunless water in the stillness. They were not focused on the wall. They were focused through it. Jorin was just a momentary blur in the foreground. And the chanting sickness. Jorin leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. That was your masterstroke, an aerosolized vector, a chemical catalyst mixed into the protein paste, designed to lower cognitive resistance and make the population more susceptible to the mimetic payload. All you had to do then was introduce the song, broadcast it, let the metal hum carry your pathogen. You're not a prophet. You're a terrorist who uses psalms instead of explosives. Jorin held his gaze, waiting. He had laid the pathology bare. He had peeled back the skin of faith and exposed the disease beneath. The normal reaction would be denial, anger, fear, a desperate attempt to protect the sacred lie. Kalis blinked. Once, a slow, deliberate motion. His gaze shifted from the infinite distance and landed on Jorin. For the first time, Jorin felt seen, and he felt assessed. The cool, detached eyes of the supposed fanatic held no fear. They held something that looked unnervingly like pity. And then Kalias's gaze drifted away again, back to the blankness of the wall. The connection was broken.
Rust rot. The frustration was a hot spike in Jorin's gut. The clinical detachment was fraying. This wasn't right. The model was predictive. He knew the patterns. The self-deception, the messianic complex, the persecution fantasies. Caelius should be speaking. He should be arguing. He should be confirming his role as the architect of his own delusion. His silence was a refutation. It was a quiet, damning statement that Jorin's scalpel was cutting at air, that his entire diagnosis, so perfectly constructed, so intellectually sound, was irrelevant. "You think this silence is a strength." Jorin's voice was tighter now, the smooth academic tone roughened by an edge of contempt. "You think it makes you a martyr? It doesn't. It's just another symptom, a calculated disengagement, a refusal to acknowledge the rational world, because doing so would shatter the framework you've built for yourself and for your victims." He paced faster. The sterile room was beginning to feel claustrophobic. The hum of the air purifier was a high, thin nerve in his ear. He saw the face of the last prophet he had dissected, a man named Malachi, who had wept and pleaded and finally confessed on the day before his followers drank the engineered poison. Malachi had been predictable, malleable. This man was a stone.
"We'll break it, you know," Jorin said, stopping at the door. He placed his hand on the cold metal panel. "Your cognitive virus. We have the source code now. We have you. We'll develop a countermimetic, a rational antibody. We'll inoculate the bellows. We'll repair the damage you've done." He was speaking to himself now, reaffirming his own faith in the face of this unnerving, passive resistance. The triumph he had felt upon entering the room had curdled into a sour, defensive anger. He had his man, but the victory felt hollow. He had won the battle, but Caelus seemed to be fighting a different war entirely, on a plane Jorin couldn't even perceive. He keyed the door open. The familiar sounds of Haven, the groaning and the dripping, rushed in, a welcome contamination to the oppressive sterility. He glanced back one last time. Caelus Rendor had not moved. He sat in his chair, a statue carved from salt and silence, his eyes fixed on a truth Jorin couldn't see, listening to a song Jorin couldn't hear. And for a terrifying, fractional moment, Jorin felt not like a doctor standing over a patient, but like a child shouting at the tide. The air in the holding room was scrubbed so clean it had no smell, which was a smell in itself, a sterile chemical void that scraped the inside of Jorin's nose. It was a stark contrast to the thick fungal brine of the bellows from which they had dragged this man. Caelus Rendor sat on the opposite side of the polymer steel table, his hands resting limply in his lap. He was unnervingly still, not the rigid stillness of fear, but the placid calm of a deep body of water. His face, etched with lines that looked more like dried riverbeds than wrinkles, held no malice, only a profound, bottomless weariness. Jorin leaned forward, the harsh LED strip overhead carving shadows into the planes of his face. The man's last words echoed in the sterile silence, a lullaby, a disharmonious song, the poetry of the delusional. Jorin stared, truly stared, for a long moment. He dissected the man's posture, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the unnerving focus in his eyes. There was no flicker of deception, no micro-expressions of guilt. Caelus believed what he was saying. That, Jorin knew, was the most dangerous part of any faith. Sincerity was the perfect camouflage for pathology. He had felt it, for a barest second, a flicker of something other than clinical certainty. The man spoke of a broken lullaby as if it were a law of physics. The sheer conviction was a force in itself, a gravity well of belief that threatened to pull Jorin's own rigid logic out of alignment. For one terrifying instant, he'd felt the ground shift beneath his feet. A momentary vertigo where the man's insane mystical framework almost made sense. A song to keep a monster asleep. It was the logic of a child's nightmare, but in Haven, where the metal groaned and the water dripped in maddening, uneven rhythms, perhaps nightmare logic was all that was left. Then the mechanism of his mind, the one he had spent a lifetime honing, clicked back into place. It was a cold, satisfying sound, like a vault door locking. The vertigo vanished, replaced by the familiar solid ground of rational deconstruction. A lullaby, Jorin repeated, his voice flat. He picked up his data pad from the table, its screen dark. He didn't need it. The analysis was already running in his head. Let's reframe that, shall we? Let's strip away the mythology and look at the system you've designed. Kalis watched him, his expression unchanging. It is not a design. It is a balancing, a duty. A duty, Jorin mimicked, his fingers drumming a restless, syncopated rhythm on the cold table. The sound was too loud in the quiet room. Your lullaby. That is the mimetic contagion in its baseline state. A low-level psychological infection. Passive, communal, self-sustaining. It keeps the host population docile, focused on the shared delusion. It gives them comfort, a sense of purpose in this rust-bucket arcology. It's elegant, I'll grant you that. A cognitive parasite that offers a symbiotic benefit. Less despair, less strain on the directorate's mental hygiene protocols. You're not a prophet, Kalis. You're a biohacker, a theologian of the viral code. Jorin felt the familiar thrill of the diagnosis locking into place. This was his territory. The chaotic, frightening unknown was being mapped, labeled, contained. The fear he'd felt moments ago was sublimating into intellectual aggression.
And this disharmonious song, Jorin leaned closer, his voice dropping. That's the interesting part. A song is just a sequence of frequencies, of data. Your passive contagion, it has a vulnerability, an acoustic trigger, a specific resonant frequency, perhaps one that mimics the metal hum madness the dampskins are already primed to hear. A key designed to interface with the lock you've so generously installed in their minds. You're saying, my quarantine procedures, the sonic deterrents, the alert klaxons, they inadvertently broadcast this trigger frequency. Jorin didn't frame it as a question. It was a statement of fact, his theory. And that caused the passive infection to mutate, to become aggressive. The lullaby became a death scream, as your acolyte so poetically put it. He watched Kalis for a reaction, for the flicker that would confirm his hypothesis. There was nothing, only a slow, deliberate blink. You hear the notes, Kalis said, his voice a low, mournful hum, but you refuse to listen to the music. Rust-rot the music, Jorin snapped, slamming his palm flat on the table. The sound cracked through the room. I'm talking about cause and effect, about a system you built. The certainty was a drug, flooding his system, sharpening his focus.
The guilt from his past, the ghost of his family, receded before its clarifying fire. This was controllable. This was a man, a design, a flaw, not some unknowable divine horror. This isn't a god waking up, Kalis. This is your weapon's safety catch being released. You engineered a mimetic plague and built in a fail-safe, a kill switch that would cause it to turn malignant if anyone interfered. A deterrent. You wanted to protect your little flock, your chorus, by making any attempt to dismantle your religion catastrophic for the entire arcology, a piece of theological blackmail. He stood up, circling the table like a predator. Kalis didn't move, didn't even turn his head, simply followed him with those ancient, weary eyes.
And now you have the audacity to blame me? To blame the directorate for trying to contain your outbreak? You lit the fuse on a bomb, and now you're trying to scold the person who accidentally bumped the table it was sitting on. Jorin stopped behind Kalis, looming over him. He could smell the damp wool of the man's tunic, the faint subterranean scent of wet stone and algae that clung to him. Jorin saw it all with perfect, unshakable clarity. Kalis wasn't a shepherd. He was an arsonist complaining about the color of the fire engines. "You are patient zero," Jorin said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, imbued with the cold weight of a final judgment. "You are the author, the engineer, and the architect of this entire crisis. Everything that is happening, every person chanting, every worker carving patterns into their skin, it all leads back to you, not as a prophet, but as the pathogen's first and most crucial alibi." Kalis finally lowered his gaze from Jorin to his own hands, resting in his lap. A faint tremor ran through his fingers. For the first time, a fissure appeared in his placid facade, a crack that revealed not guilt, but a sorrow so profound it seemed to drink the very light from the room. "The sound you made," Kalis said, his voice barely audible. "It wasn't a key. It was a scream in a sleeping nursery." He looked up, and Jorin felt that flicker of vertigo again, that terrifying pull of an alternate, impossible truth. "And you have no idea what you have woken." Jorin crushed it. He walled it off with the hard brick of his own logic. The man was a master manipulator, framing his own culpability as a dire warning. It was the oldest trick in the Zealot's handbook. He was no longer just certain. He was righteous. Kalis Rendor wasn't the enemy. He was the disease. And Jorin Vask was the cure.
Breaker stood a few paces behind Jorin, his augmented frame a study in coiled stillness, his presence a heavy weight in the humid air. Jorin held up his data slate, the screen casting a sterile blue light on his face. "The analysis is complete, Kalis. Your chorus is a classic case of stimulus-response conditioning amplified by mass psychogenic illness. The resonant frequencies of the refinery machinery, the metal hum madness the locals are so fond of, acted as the initial vector. Your rituals simply provided a narrative framework for the auditory hallucinations, a feedback loop of shared delusion." He tapped the screen, his movements sharp and precise. "This shrine," he gestured dismissively toward the biomechanical horror pulsing in the main chamber, "is a fascinating but predictable manifestation of psychosomatic architecture. The workers believed they were merging with a higher power, so their minds, under extreme duress, forced a biological expression of that belief. They've overwritten their own cellular functions. It's a tragedy, not a miracle." Kalis finally looked up. His eyes, clear and unnervingly serene, held no trace of the fanaticism Jorin expected, only a deep, profound pity.
You use so many words, theologian. Kalis's voice was a low, melodic hum, a perfect match for the subliminal frequency that saturated the refinery. You so many beautiful, intricate boxes to contain a truth that is the size of an ocean. Truth is quantifiable, Jorin retorted, his voice tight. It's data. It's pathology. What you have is a mimetic virus, and I have found patient zero. Once I've deprogrammed you, the rest of the coral will collapse like a house of cards. This was the final nail, the moment of diagnostic certainty he craved. He was in control. He was the rational mind imposing order on the madness. It was an intellectual exorcism, and it felt like absolution. Kalis smiled faintly, a sad, knowing expression. You think I am the singer. I am merely the one who cups his hands around the flame to keep the gale from putting it out. You have just kicked down the door and invited the hurricane to dinner. Spare me the provincial metaphors. You're a cult leader who has lost control of his flock. It's the oldest story in my textbook.
You are the one who is disharmonious, Kalis whispered, his gaze drifting past Jorin toward the shrine. You came here shouting, and you have woken something that must be sung to sleep. Jorin laughed, a short, sharp bark of contempt. Sung to sleep? By a god you invented from metal shavings and fungal spores? I've heard it all. You can preach to the walls. I'm done here. He turned his back on the cell, a gesture of alternate dismissal. He felt a surge of triumph, the clean, cold satisfaction of a problem solved. It was over. And then it wasn't. It began not as a sound, but as a pressure, a deep, bone-jarring vibration that started in the floor and climbed the pylons of the refinery like a monstrous, invisible vine. It was a note an octave below hearing, a resonant frequency that vibrated the fluid in Jorin's eyeballs and the fillings in his teeth. "What is that?" Brecker grunted, shifting his weight, his hand moving instinctively toward the sidearm holstered on his thigh. The sickly green glow of the biomechanical shrine at the chamber's center flickered. The gentle rhythmic pulsing that Jorin had dismissed as a biological side effect began to accelerate. Thump-thump, thump-thump. Thump-thump, thump-thump. It's responding, Jorin breathed, his triumph curdling into a knot of ice in his stomach. The low thrum escalated into a piercing, high-frequency tone that drilled directly into his skull. It wasn't a sound wave traveling through the air. It was a signal being broadcast directly into his consciousness. With it came a flash of something utterly alien, not a thought, not an image, but the psychic texture of a continent-sized intelligence stirring from a billion-year dream. It was a feeling of immense, indifferent pressure, the way a diver feels the weight of the ocean above him. Every LED light in the refinery complex flickered in unison with the accelerating pulse. They blazed with impossible brightness. Then, one by one, they exploded. Shards of hot polymer rained down in the sudden, encroaching darkness. "Get down!" Brecker yelled, shoving Jorin hard. They hit the rusted grating of the floor, just as the main power conduits along the ceiling arced with terrifying violence. Blue-white lightning tore through the air, casting the entire chamber in a series of epileptic strobe-lit tableaus. The air crackled, thick with the scent of ozone and burning plastic. Jorin's data slate, still clutched in his hand, let out a pathetic electronic shriek and went dark. His connection to logic, to data, to reason, severed. Then came the wave. A pure, silent blast of psychic energy radiated outward from the shrine. Jorin felt it wash over him, a disorienting vertigo that made the world tilt on its axis. It wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was utterly indifferent, the psychic equivalent of a whale breaching the surface, unaware of the plankton scattered by its passage. The entire structure of the protein refinery groaned, not the familiar groans of stressed metal Jorin had grown used to in Haven, but a deep, agonized shriek as titanic support beams warped and twisted. A shower of rust and condensation fell from the ceiling, pattering against the floor like heavy rain. And then, as suddenly as it began, silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water and the faint, fizzing crackle of dying electronics. The main power was gone. The hum of the purifiers, the thrum of the machinery, the flicker of the lights, all dead. The only illumination came from the shrine itself, which had returned to its slow, gentle, sickly green pulse as if nothing had happened. Jorin pushed himself up, his ears ringing, his head throbbing. The wave of alien consciousness had receded, leaving behind a nauseating mental echo, like the afterimage of a blinding light. He scrambled for a rational explanation. A cascade power failure, a geothermal tremor overloading the grid. It had to be. It was a coincidence, a terrifying, impossible coincidence. But as he stared into the gloom, his eyes adjusting, a single sound cut through his desperate rationalizations. It was a sound that made his blood run cold. Clunk. It was a heavy, metallic, and utterly final sound, unmistakable. Slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, Jorin turned his head. Brecker was already looking, his weapon now drawn and aimed into the darkness. The single emergency light above the holding cell flickered weakly, its beam cutting through the dust-filled air. It illuminated the polymer glass door. The heavy magnetic lock, its power source severed, had disengaged. The door to Kalis Rumdor's cell stood ajar.
The klaxon died with a final choked gargle. Darkness swallowed the corridor, absolute for a half-second, before the emergency power kicked in, not with a steady hum, but a palsied flicker. Red LEDs strobed across the slick, weeping walls, painting everything in arterial bursts. The air, already thick with the familiar scents of brine and ozone, now carried the acrid tang of a blown conduit. "He's loose!" I yelled, my voice swallowed by the groaning of stressed metal from the deck above. "Brecker, containment protocol, now!" Kalis Rendor was a silhouette against the strobing red, already halfway down the corridor. He wasn't running. There was a terrifying deliberateness to his stride, a calm procession into the labyrinthine gloom of the bellows. It was the walk of a man who knew he wasn't being pursued, but escorted. Brecker was already moving. He was a creature of brutal economy, his augmented frame a blur of gray fatigues and dark purpose. The floor plates rattled under his heavy boots as he closed the distance. He didn't draw a sidearm. His orders were for capture. His hands, sheathed in worn synth leather, were weapons enough. Then they appeared. Not from side passages or hidden alcoves. They simply stepped out of the shadows that danced between the strobing lights. One moment the corridor was empty, save for Kalis's retreating form. The next, it was choked. There were a dozen of them, maybe more. Dampskins, all of them. Their faces were gaunt, etched with the familiar weariness of the bellows, but their eyes held something else, a vacant placidity. The early-stage symptoms of the choral infection. They were the less affected, the ones whose bodies hadn't yet begun to bloom with alien choral, but whose minds were already tilled soil for the entity's song. They formed a line, shoulder to shoulder, a human wall. Their hands were empty, held loosely at their sides. They didn't chant, they didn't shout, they just stood there, their expressions as impassive as the rusting bulkhead behind them. They were a barricade of flesh and bone. Brecker didn't even break stride. This was just an obstacle, a variable in his tactical equation. "Move, Directorate Authority!" he boomed, his voice a gravelly tear in the fabric of the sudden silence.
The wall didn't flinch. Their eyes, catching the sickly blue-green glow of a fungal patch on the ceiling, seemed to look through him. Kalis was almost at the bend in the corridor, about to be swallowed by the darkness for good. "Brecker," I urged, a knot of cold dread tightening in my gut. He reached them. The first was a woman, her hair plastered to her skull by the humidity. Brecker didn't strike. He planted a hand on her shoulder and shoved. It was a move meant to spin and unbalance, efficient and disabling. The woman stumbled back, her bare feet slapping against the wet deck plate, but she didn't cry out. She didn't even raise her hands to break her fall. She crashed into the wall behind her with a dull thud, then slid to the floor, her gaze still fixed on some point beyond us. Before the space she'd occupied was even clear, a man with a scarred face stepped into it, seamlessly rebuilding the line. He blinked slowly, once. I saw the flicker of cognitive dissonance in Brecker's posture. His training had no subroutine for this. Enemies fought back. Civilians panicked and scattered. These people did neither. They were obstructions, like furniture. "I said move," Brecker growled, the threat in his voice now laced with frustration. He grabbed the scarred man by the front of his tunic, intending to hurl him aside, but the man just went limp, becoming dead weight. Two others from the line stepped forward, not to attack Brecker, but to brace their comrade, their bodies pressing against him, reinforcing the wall. Brecker was now holding up 3 people, his momentum completely absorbed. My mind raced, trying to categorize the behavior. It wasn't suicidal martyrdom. There was no religious ecstasy, no fervor. It was functional, a passive defense mechanism, the flock insulating the shepherd. I felt a surge of professional revulsion. This was the pathology I was here to dismantle. Faith weaponized to the point it overwrote the most basic instinct of self-preservation. "This is a mimetic compulsion," I shouted at them, my voice sounding shrill and academic against the groaning steel. "Your leader is using you. You have to break the conditioning." My words were less than whispers in a hurricane. They registered nothing. Kalis had vanished around the corner.
"Rust rot," Brecker snarled. He let the men go, shoving them back into the line. He changed tactics. This was no longer about moving them, it was about getting through them. He took a half-step back, his augmented fist clenching. It was a non-lethal strike, a concussive blow to the sternum designed to incapacitate, to drop a man gasping for air. It was a tool he had used 100 times. He struck. The sound was horribly intimate. A dull, wet thwomp of metal-laced knuckles against a thin chest. The man he hit, young, barely more than a boy, doubled over, a sharp, involuntary grunt escaping his lips, his face contorted in a mask of pure animal pain. But he didn't fall. He didn't swing back. His hands clenched at his sides, knuckles white. He took the blow, absorbed it, and straightened back up, his eyes watering, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Brecker, not with hate, but with a kind of serene, sorrowful acceptance. Then he resumed his place in the wall. Brecker froze. His fist was still clenched, but his arm was locked at his side. He stared at the man, at the rapidly forming dark patch on his thin tunic. He could have hit him again. He could have broken his ribs.
hit him hard enough to kill him. His augmentations gave him that power. But the boy's reaction had disarmed him more effectively than any weapon. To fight a man who fights back is combat. To beat a man who offers no resistance, that is something else entirely. That is just breaking things. He looked back at me, his face a storm of confusion and fury under the strobing lights. His protocol had failed. His purpose had been nullified. They won't fight, he said, the words full of disbelief. No, I replied, the single word feeling heavy and final. They believe. That's their weapon. Brecker let out a long, frustrated breath, a sound like a failing steam valve. He uncurled his bruised fist. In that moment, he wasn't a directorate enforcer. He was just a man from the bellows, confronted with a kind of madness he recognized but could no longer overcome. He had been a gang leader. He knew violence. But this wasn't violence. It was absorption. It was a sponge of faith, soaking up his rage and leaving him empty. The red lights continued their frantic, rhythmic pulse. The chorus members stood, a silent, patient monument to our failure. Some swayed slightly, a barely perceptible motion, as if rocked by a deep, unheard current. A low hum began to fill the corridor, so low it was felt more than heard, a vibration in the teeth and bones. It came from them, from all of them, a resonant frequency of absolute conviction. Kalis was gone, and we were left standing before his living shield, defeated not by an army, but by an idea. Brecker stared at his hands, then at the impassive faces before him. The chaos of the escape had bled away, replaced by a cold, tactical stillness. It was the stillness of checkmate.